ranking WoW's easiest melee DPS specs. Which ones can you have the easiest time getting into? Which ones can your grandma play? And which ones are as hard as a gamer's morning wood? We're gonna go right into it with Arms Warrior. This is probably going to be a little bit controversial, but I will state my case. I believe Arms is average. It's not a particularly complicated spec to play, although there are a few caveats to keep in mind when you're trying to do big damage with Arms. First of all, it's AoE rotation when it comes to burst, which is a very bursty AoE rotation. Needs you to pop your cooldowns in a very specific order, considering that now you cannot cancel your blade storms anymore, and you have 2 blade storms, and you want to maintain those buffs. Those, I think it's called Hurricane. You want to maintain it as much and as high as possible on as many skills as possible, kind of snapshotting some of its power. And there's also the question of swing timers. Now, you can probably play Arms without a swing timer Wikara, which is going to be fine. But you need to understand how the rage works, because it doesn't generate rage the way Fury does. It comes in chunks. It comes when you swing your melee, and you have to kind of prepare for that. So the playstyle is slightly more tactical, let's say, and it does reward you if you understand that and you kind of plan your rage consumption accordingly, so you don't spam your, I don't know, executes, and then when your Mortal Strike comes off cooldown, you're out of rage for some reason. Next up, Assassination. This is going to require even more caveats. Again, just to kind of know the context, Assassination is also average. Now, its single target is fairly easy, so you could say we're gonna put it into the easy tier for single target, but its AoE is hard because you do have to juggle a lot of things in AoE, because that's just how Assassination works. Hopefully not after the rework, and because of that we're gonna average it out in the average ranking of the tier list, because it only makes sense. Outlaw is also hard. Okay, let me preface this. In terms of how the spec works, it's not particularly complicated to kind of figure out how you have to do it. However, there are a lot of buttons that you need to press, and you do have to press them fairly fast. And you can say, man, I'm just pressing my buttons and I'm doing damage anyway. Okay, listen, not everybody's a genius or a dumbass. I don't know what your overall is, but Outlaw does require a little bit of a thought put into, and you know, kind of have to react to the procs properly, not waste it, not over-generate combo points. Is not as straightforward as, let's say, Assassination, right? When it comes to going into the spec and trying to optimize his damage as much as possible. You can say that maybe its AoE is easier than Assassinations because you just pop Blade Flurry, right? And you just cleave as fairly simple. So from that perspective, maybe its rotation is fairly simple. You learn the single target rotation, you can do everything with Outlaw. While as with Assassination, you kind of have to think a little bit. But I strongly believe that its overall rotation, if you want to be efficient, because, you know, anybody can play anything, right? If we're gonna approach you from the topic of, oh, but WoW is an easy game, then all specs are easy, okay? But trying to not necessarily master it, but go deeper into it and try to pull out as much out of it as possible, you'll have to sweat a little bit more with Outlaw than with, let's say, Arms and Assassination. Next up, Survival. A controversial spec when it comes to MarcelianOnline, because I think Survival is piss easy. However, the way it works and kind of how you have to juggle some of the things is not that straightforward. So I'm gonna put it into average, but I still lean towards easy. I do not think Survival is a hard spec. It used to be hard. Dragonflight made it considerably easy, and unless they give us a weird tier set that just makes you play some weird combination of abilities, it's likely going to remain average towards easy until it gets a rework, which it should. The only reason it's not an easy, in my opinion, is that certain talent combinations don't really work very well, and certain talent combinations should not work well at all, or not should, but they don't actually. I think they still haven't fixed the interaction between Coordinate Assault and Spearhead, where you're still not supposed to use 2 at the same time, which is not something that any other spec in the game has. So for that reason, I don't think it's easy, because you can make the mistake of, you know, playing very poorly and messing up your cooldowns. Enhancement Shaman is as hard as my morning. What? No, I'm not gonna talk about that anymore. Enhancement Shaman is probably the hardest spec in the game, definitely one of the hardest melees in the game in terms of what you actually have to do. I do have to preface this, at the end of the day, it's not an impossible spec to play. I play it, and if I can do it, you can do it as well, and anybody can just have fun with enhancement. But it does require a lot to get into it. It's very particular with its effects, it's very particular with its globals, because you can run into downtime if you mess up your rotation. I know I have, and that's not necessarily nice. Not to mention that if we're going to be talking about Season 2 enhancement, the tier set interacts differently with your spec, and well, because of it was nerfed a little while ago, you might not actually figure out the fact that you're not supposed to pop chain lightning in single target, even though that is the main buffer of your force set. I believe that's where the force set comes into play. The interaction between Primordial Wave and your Maelstrom generations and your dog's cooldown reduction is not particularly straightforward, and you can and will mess it up if you played enhancement for the first time, because I know I have wasted a lot of Maelstrom weapon. When you get your Ascendance procs as well, your rotation kind of slightly changes, and it kind of matters how quickly you get your wind strikes. Do you have time to fit in a global cooldown in between those wind strikes? If not, is it worth it? Do you lose a total wind strike, or do you lose like one wind strike cast per Ascendance proc? That kind of breakpoint, you won't find it on a lot of other specs. Not to mention that if you do mess up your combinations and the way you're building up to things and consuming other things, you will probably lose a lot more DPS than you think. And that's enhancement. Feral, again, I believe it's on the average side of things, and you're gonna see a lot of specs in the average tier list. Now, Feral is probably, I guess it's maybe a situation similar to Arms, where it's not complicated to wrap your head around Feral. You generate combo points, you spend them on bleeds or bites, right? There are a couple of caveats with Feral that new players might get into a little bit slower than you want. Obviously, Blood Talents is one of them. Blood Talents has been simplified over the years tremendously, but it is something that you kind of have to be aware of. And if you're not using weak auras or any add-ons that is telling you what generator you need to press to keep up your blood talents, you kind of have to do the math in your head, and you kind of have to think, okay, I use this, I have 4 generators, sometimes I don't want to use 1 or 2 of them. How do I keep up my blood talents? Not to mention that during Berserk, most of the time, you're going to be using 1 generator and 1 finisher back-to-back. Generator, finisher. And keeping up blood talents for those finishers can require a little bit of practice that no other spec usually goes through. Not to mention that if you do want to play your Berserk cooldown properly, or your Incarnation, or whatever you play, you want to make sure that you kind of snapshot your rakes properly and your rips properly, as much as this matters. Usually, Blizzard doesn't like this kind of mechanic, so they kind of always nerf it a little bit until it becomes a little bit irrelevant and you can just do whatever. But it seems like you can still get a little bit of a damage gain if you do snapshot those, or can end up in a lot more damage gain. And you can probably ignore it, which is probably why Feral isn't in the hard category, because I would have put into hard if these snapshots would have been very, very important. But again, it depends on what content you do. It's very, very important if you're a top-end mythic creator and you're pushing super high keys. But if you're just playing for fun and having some average interactions with the content, it's average. Haha. Frost Decay. Now, my grandma can play Frost Decay because piss is easy. It's the quintessential build resource, spend resource, build resource, spend resource. If you play Breath of Citragosa, you only have to build resource, and that's about it. Sure, the way you build resource matters and staying on the target matters. However, that's kind of the extent of the difficulty of Frost Decay. We can always talk about, maintaining proper buffs, making proper procs, don't waste things, don't use Howling Blast and Frost Strike when your killing machine is up. Clearly, having, those death and decays properly set up, that's obviously very, very important. But outside of that, it's one of the most simplest specs in the game to play. You're getting punished very, very minuscule if you mess up. Sure, everybody gets punished, but I don't think Frost takes the same amount of punishment as I would say Arms, or definitely not Enhancement, will when it comes to playing the game. Next up on the list of the things that my grandma can play, and she still doesn't want to play WoW, and I don't know why, because every grandma should bring 2 big 2-hander broomsticks to whip their grandchildren. Is that a Romanian thing? Doesn't matter, because Fury Warrior is actually simple to play. Obviously, it has its unique interactions, but it has been simplified, not to mention that you're not playing Odin's Fury anymore, so you can have 1 fewer button. It's super fast-paced, and once you get into it, which is not as hard as getting into other specs, it becomes tremendously monotone and robotic, which I guess that's fine. It's very satisfying. You probably press 1 or 2 generators, sometimes 3 if you are low on gear, and then rampage. And that's about it. The only difficult thing is keeping up, let's say, Whirlwind buffs for AoE cleave, which is arguably easier than keeping up Breath of Sindragosa for Frost Decay. So I would still consider Fury something that you can play because your grandma is already playing this. Havoc Demon Hunter. This is a contentious topic because Havoc Demon Hunter has a lot of builds. Momentum, from what I know so far, is still a good build to play, but the reason why Havoc is average and not easy, although let's say BFA Havoc would have been easy, is because it kind of matters how you do your things. It kind of matters how you charge in. It kind of matters when you pop your immolation, when you pop your I-beams, and so on and so forth. Not super much, but it matters enough where you can mess up. Obviously, we've seen those Havocs that charge off the platform because it is a unique playstyle that no other melee has in the way that it's very, very mobile, and you will be using your mobility in combat actively to increase your DPS. It's not as impactful as it once used to be, but it's still impactful enough where if you're not used to playing a spec like Havoc, you might charge too far. You might not charge enough, or you might go into the fire, or things like that, or accidentally glide past a certain thing. It happens. So in that sense, I guess Havoc was a little bit more harder, maybe less to do with the actual rotation that gives you the damage, but more so with the mechanics of the spec/class. Red Paladin has become an easy spec. People have been memeing on Red Paladin for being easy. I don't think it's as easy as Fury or Frost Decay, for instance, but it's fairly straightforward to pick up, and I think because of this, it is one of the better melee specs in the game currently designed so that anybody can play Red, anybody can just go into it, have fun. There is some intricacy, some synergies there, but they have been tremendously simplified. Execution Sentence and the 1-minute build has been neutered down in terms of its complexity. You don't even have Final Reckoning anymore with Execution Sentence, so there's that. Divine Toll is particularly just always, the cooldowns kind of always match with each other, so it's very hard to mess it up. And now that you can even spend 4 Holy Power on your finishers, make it easier for you to, you know, generate and spend, which is the crux of Red Paladin. You just generate Holy Power and you spend Holy Power, and your cooldowns are mostly pressed whenever they become available. It's not a lot of thought process put into it like, let's say, ARMS would have, where you kind of really need to press your cooldowns in a specific order and at a specific time. Subtlety Rogue. Again, this is hard. It's not Morningwood hard, but it is hard enough where you might mess it up, or you will mess it up if you haven't played Subtlety before. It has an intricate playstyle, and Subtlety has always been kind of more complex in terms of the rogue style. Sure, its AoE is explosive and it's fairly straightforward, but with the new talent system and the fact that you can use different kind of finishers, I think it's really cool. And the way you rotate your symbols of death and shadow blades and things like that is not as straightforward as, let's say, I don't know, ARMS cooldowns could be, right? With ARMS, you might get punished, but with Subtlety, you're probably gonna get punished a little bit more if you mess up your rotation, which is why I consider Subtlety to be a little bit harder. I would have put in some Morningwood, since I'm not a big rogue player, but I'm gonna take my bias aside and think about the fact that maybe it's not as hard as Enhancement, although it is close-ish. Unholy, also a very interesting spec. I would put it into average as well. Now, I think Unholy has been kind of simplified over the years. Clearly, all DK specs are nowhere near where they were in, I don't know, WoD, MoB, definitely not in Wrath, where you had to juggle 3 to 4 different types of runes, different types of cooldowns from different types of specs, because, you know, we had Breath of Sindragosa, I believe. I think even Blood Decay had Breath of Sindragosa back in the day. So yeah, but Unholy is a lot more straightforward nowadays. You have diseases, you have pets, you can mix and match some of the builds. You kind of do have to, you know, figure out a little bit how you're going to be spending your runic power, how you're interlacing your epidemics with your generators, how are you using your Death Decay to its most. And if you even play Bursting Source, which is, I haven't really seen a lot of people play that, but, you know, maybe I haven't been looking at the right Unholies, then you probably will have to kind of min-max, kind of micromanage certain things, more so than you would have with Red Paladin, but maybe not as much as you would with Outlaw and Subtlety. And last but not least, we have Windwalker. Windwalker is also kind of average. Dragonflight has simplified the spec tremendously. I would have probably put it into hard, but it feels like Windwalker has never gotten to that hard point. Its mechanics are different than with other specs. It's not a spec that relies heavily on haste. Clearly, it's kind of like how, let's say, Red is now. You have to juggle some abilities. Obviously, maintaining your mastery is very important, especially if you play even, I think it's called hit combo. Plus, you have the, oh my god, they keep changing its name. The capstone where you charge with your tiger palm, right? That can also cause problems with mobility and positioning if you're not aware. Similar to Havoc, you also have Whirling Dragon Punch, which locks you into an animation that's particularly long, and you might get hit or clipped by some AoE that could essentially kill you, but that's usually something that happens only in the higher echelon, higher end game parts of World of Warcraft. Other than that, you kind of do have to micromanage certain things sometimes. You kind of have to micromanage your clones when you play Storm Wrath and Fire. Although the playstyle has been simplified, I believe, from the Shadowlands, when you really wanted to control your clones properly to take advantage of some of the conduits that we had at the time, but now it's seemingly a little bit more simple. You do wait for procs with Spinning Crane kick, but let's say it does require a little bit more effort to get right than Red. And maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because what's important is for you to have fun. And it's hard to have fun when WoW was destroyed by DPS meters. What am I talking about, you're saying? Well, check this video out where we actually clarify why WoW has been destroyed by DPS meters. Maybe a little bit dramatic, but still true that DPS meters changed WoW. Maybe not for the best.